Hi everyone, Magnus here covering the 2024 Chess Olympiad that just happened. Team India has claimed victory, even though I think they were so far ahead by yesterday that they could have even not showed up today and still would have won by joint first. But that is not the case. They did show up. They won in a really dominant fashion, 3.5, 2.5. Very impressive stuff from the Indian team overall. So congratulations to all of them. And joint second is shared between three teams, and that is USA, Uzbekistan, and China. I think I said joint second. I don't really know. But actually, by tie breaks, it ends up being that the US is in second and Uzbekistan in third. So a lot of the favorites doing very well. Of course, India, US, Uzbekistan, and China. But at the end of the day, no one could quite keep up with the wrath of the Indian team. Simply win, 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 win. They did not lose a single match, only lost one single game, I think. And yeah, so only one draw, one chink in the pretty spotless armor of the Indian team. Everyone else lost at least one match. So, without any more rambling, let's get into the two games that I would like to cover today, starting with Gukesh. This game was a really incredible showcase from Gukesh on how to combat the London system, which is what Fedoseev, who is a very, very strong Slovenian grandmaster, chose to employ. He's known by the pseudonym Big Fish. You might have seen him in Titled Tuesday. A very good player, has beaten Magnus and others on many occasions and won Titled Tuesdays. So definitely he is no slouch. But he goes for the London system with this classic two ponies, pyramid formation, and the bishop on the outside. Meanwhile, Gukesh develops, puts pawns in the center. Very, very principled response to the London. And rather than going for queen to b3 with white, which is pretty standard, you attack this pawn, black goes queen to b6. Sometimes there's an exchange and then there's pawns being pushed, or we reach an early endgame. We see queen to a4 with the idea of going bishop to b5 and lining up on the knight on c6. Gukesh plays knight to d7 though, nice move here, unpinning this pony and potentially planning f6 and e5 plans in the future. We see bishop b5 anyway, queen c8 covering everything up, and rook comes to the c-file, looking for the explosive c4 pawn push and trying to break things open, seeing that the rook can now look down on the queen. Pawn to a6, Gukesh initiates trades first, exchanges off everything, and claims these doubled c-pawns here, as I have pointed out, and also has a very strong central clamp and ideas to move the rook over the b-file, as well as push this a-pawn down the board. It looks like an interesting imbalance for Gukesh. Pristine pawn structure for Fedoseev, but at the same time, that can always be fixed. And the open b-file and bishop pair seems like it is enough to give black an edge. So we do see c4, Fedoseev exploding the position. He wants to try and exploit these doubled c-pawns, but f6 from Gukesh, looking to counter-strike in the center and build the huge black center here. Knight to b3. And now knight to b3 is apparently a mistake. This pawn, for one, can start running down to attack the knight when these knights go to either b3 or g3. They're often very vulnerable to flank pawn pushes. Additionally, the move knight to b6 could have been quite dangerous as it goes after the c4 pawn, and white doesn't really want to take this c5 pawn. But we do see pawn to a5, the second choice of the engine from Gukesh, and he retreats his bishop back because obviously he doesn't want to give up his lovely bishop pair. These bishops are so strong right now, so he does retreat to f5. King e2, Fedoseev puts his king in the center because, as you're told, once queens have come off, the kings come out to play. But at the same time, that might not be such a safe motto in this game, considering so many pieces are still on the board, 2 rooks and 3 minors. It's still a pretty sketchy spot for the white king to be in. We see a4 kicks the knight and h5. Now Gukesh is going crab mode here, expanding on both sides of the board, trying to push back all the ponies and make use of his bishop pair. Fedoseev preemptively retreats the bishop back to g3, trying to get out of the move g5, although the move g5 can still be played with the idea of h4, and if white goes h4, then black can go g4 and kick this pony. But Gukesh doesn't go for that. He goes for a more slow move, bishop to e7. He plays it very quickly, mind you, 30 seconds only. And he's basically saying, Fedoseev, do your worst. It's your turn. I'm going to go king f7 and improve my position slowly, and I don't think you can touch me. So we do see rook c3. Fedoseev says, you know what, I'm going to start trying to put some counterplay down the c file, king to f7, and the rooks stack up. Gukesh brings his own rook into the game. I'm not 100% what this rook's doing. It does guard the pawn and activate off a more passive square, but at the same time the rook doesn't have a huge future on c8. So anyway, we see a capture and pawn to e5. And the move pawn to e5 is a really nice pawn sacrifice. Actually, that might be the deep idea behind rook to c8, is that after this capture you can push the pawn, and now this rook is here to blockade the passed c pawn that we're about to see created. And the reason e5 is so strong is because all of the white pieces, like the knights, the two knights and the bishop, are just totally restricted, completely hemmed in. They cannot move. This pawn center is just blockading them in. So Fedoseev does what he can. He tries to make the most of his passed c pawn, but very wise from Gukesh, had moved his rook already to the c file, so this pawn cannot promote very easily. Knight to b6 played, as the knight was under attack from the pawn on c6, and this knight may not look very well placed. It can't actually go anywhere, but at the same time it cannot be attacked, and we're about to see the explosive way that Gukesh unravels and activates all of his pieces very nicely. A3 is played because Fedoseev doesn't want A3 to be played from Gukesh, create a weakness on A2 potentially, which can be sacrificed and push this pawn through. But A3 in of itself leaves Gukesh with laser eyes for the B2 pawn. He wants to go win that guy. This is a new weakness. Knight goes back to E1, covering up. This looks pretty passive by Fedoseev. He wants to go knight to D3 and defend this B pawn, and after the rook attacks the pawn and the knight goes to D3, it is not bishop takes D3 and rook takes B2 that's very good, because then you can go C7, rook C6, and try to get some counterplay with your passed c pawn. No, it is in fact the very, very nice move, pawn to d4, trading some more pawns in the center and noticing how vulnerable this white rook is on the c3 square. After the exchange, the rook cannot go to this square or this square. Bishop covers and knight covers. The pawn covers this square, so the rook is forced to c2. And now the stunning move, Gukesh moves his rook to the e file. This is so devastating because the king is the only piece defending the knight, which is the only piece stopping the bishop from attacking the rook. And now if the knight were to move, then black would just capture the rook and be up an exchange. But at the same time, if the king moves, then you will win the knight, which is even worse. So knight goes to f3. This is a desperate attempt to try and cover up. And I guess Fedoseev's idea is that now if you move the bishop somewhere random, king to d2, and maybe you can survive. But Gukesh remains precise to the very end, plays rook to b3, targeting the knight on d3 with this bishop. The only way to really defend it is to move this f-knight to e1, guarding the pony here, but that just instantly loses to the move bishop to b4. Gukesh plays it with confidence. He's going to capture this knight here. Then he's going to chop down the forest by capturing the exchange and simply win the c pawn and the b pawn, convert his position up the exchange, and that is exactly what happens. Really straightforward, lovely chess from Gukesh. Also getting pretty fancy in the next couple moves. He puts his knight here, attacking the bishop. Now you may notice, why is this pawn not being captured? Well, that's because a3 and this pawn would sneak through, so that's not an option. White is pretty much paralyzed here. Black attacks the bishop, says I want to take your bishop and then push my pawn down the board. So the knight instead moves back, which is a pretty tricky move. The whole idea behind this knight move is that you're blocking the view of blocking the view of the rook so that you can no longer capture the bishop because this pawn would promote. But Gukesh, ever sharp, just simply captures the pawn on d7. I'm sure he saw this in advance, played pretty much instantly, and after bishop captures, he plays d2. King moves back, rook checks, and rook to b2 ends the game because rook to e1 is an unstoppable threat. The only way to stop it is knight to e2, after which rook to b1, king d2, and the knight will be skewered. This is an easy win for Gukesh. Up a pawn and an exchange in an endgame. All he has to do is possibly even sacrifice a rook for the pawn and the bishop. 2 pawns up in a rook endgame. That is a simple win for a guy like Gukesh. So really just an incredible performance overall from Gukesh. I believe he's got like, I don't even know, 3,056 performance rating over 10 games. That is simply crazy. He's plus 30 points at the 2700 level, 9 out of 10. This is a monster streak like no other. But now let's move on to the game with Praggnanandhaa, who I think has been a little bit underrepresented in this event. And now that's not to say that his play has been bad at all, because it hasn't. It's just been much more solid, lots and lots of draws. He's still on a positive score, but he's just been really putting in the work on board 2, getting the job done, and really just being a critical member to help bring home the bag for India. So let's get into that game. So getting into the Praggnanandhaa game, he starts with the white pieces, plays pawn to d4. Demchenko, a very strong Slovenian grandmaster, also very popular in the online sphere, plays pawn to d5. We see a queen's gambit accepted, and knight to f3. Rather than the more ambitious move, pawn to e4, Pragg obviously might not want to delve into Demchenko's preparation. He goes for a more conservative approach, knight to f3 and e3, probably going to collect the pawn on c4 like this, and he'll simply have the 2 center pawns for the 1 and try to claim a small edge. So we see knight f6, e3, captures, and c5. Demchenko striking in the center, wants to try and undermine White's central majority. We see castles, knight c6, knight c3, and a6. Demchenko wants to play pawn to b5, and if you allow it, with a move like rook e1, then b5 and bishop to b7, black has completely equalized and probably even taken the advantage here with this mass of development. Free moving knights and bishops are very nicely placed. But instead of this, of course, Pragg plays the preventative move, bishop to d3, getting out of the way of pawn to b5, so that if you were to play this move now, you'd run into trouble after something like a4, pawn to b4, knight e4, captures, and bishop to b7. All of a sudden, bishop d2, and your position's kind of collapsing with the rook coming to the c file, the king still in the center, significant pressure down this way, and if you try and lash out with something like f5, just captures, knight e5 hits the bishop, and at this point even queen h5, and you are just in huge trouble on the king side. No castles for you, and very weak c-file infiltration. Alternatively, if you were to go pawn to b5, and after a4, b4, knight e4, if you were to try, say, bishop to b7 here, there's just knight takes on c5, so that's not possible. And if you were to play, let's say, a4, c4, looking to counterattack the bishop here, because you cannot go bishop to e4 because the knight would capture, then there's just ab. And the point is that you cannot capture this guy because the rook would hang, and if you take the bishop, I will take your knight and simply reclaim the pawn with at least a 1 pawn advantage, but probably more after defending this c6 pawn, which will be a huge thorn. So bishop d3, we see captures, bishop e7, bishop g5. Simple developing here. Now you may notice what has happened is that white has acquired an isolated queen's pawn that looks very similar to positions that may emerge from either like a Smith-Morra gambit, or maybe even Alapin Sicilian, which is something that I like to play with white. And the idea here is that white gets lots of activity around the isolated pawn. Meanwhile, black attempts to blockade the pawn with something like b6, bishop b7. And if black can do this successfully, black should be a little bit better coming for the endgame, but at the same time, white is going to try and bludgeon you and checkmate you potentially, and that, that's no good. I don't care if you have an isolated pawn if your king is getting mated. So rook e1, we see the knight go to the center and pawn to h4. Obviously, Pragg has devious intentions on the king's side, wants to keep his bishop here as long as possible. Now, you're going to notice as a theme in this game, Pragg was playing loads and loads of counter-attacking moves. Really, really nice Zug in between moves after h6. For example, here comes the first one, knight takes d5, great move, pretty much the only move. If you were to retreat the bishop, say, then I guess you can just go bishop f6, start going after this pawn, and black is simply doing well. No more attack on the king, you've kicked the bishop away. So instead we see knight takes in the center here, and let's say if you were to capture, what was I thinking? I think it was if knight takes, pawn takes, then bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, and white is just a little bit better in this position because the black pawn is on d5, and white can take full control of the center files as well as attack this pawn because it's on a light square, and there is black having the light squared bishop. So something like queen to b3 would prevent this bishop from developing, go after the pawn, and white is comfortably better. So obviously Demchenko didn't like this. He took back with the queen, and after bishop to e4, another counter-attacking move, still the bishop on h4 hangs. He finally returns the bishop to e3. Now the knight has left this square and can no longer capture it, and potentially in the future he's gonna, possibly sacrifice a pawn to open it up. But at the very least, this bishop is a pretty decent piece, and this bishop is a terrible piece. But it does go to d7, we see queen d2, and now the bishop and the queen line up on this h6 pawn, potentially threatening some kind of sacrifices. I don't know if they're actually very good. Engine doesn't even respect it that much. But obviously Demchenko was possibly a little bit scared, maybe seeing some ghosts. He plays pawn to f5, trying to make it so that he's attacking your bishop and can get the rook into the defense if Pragg were to go for the sacrifice. But Pragg, of course, counterattacks the queen, doesn't play bishop to c2 first. I don't really understand the benefit of having the bishop on f4, other than the fact that you are covering the e5 square one more time and preventing a pawn push, which actually does make a lot of sense now that I think about it. But maybe this pawn push wasn't such a threat. If you go bishop c2 and then e5, there would be something like bishop to b3 and then captures here. And white would seem to be doing quite well because you cannot take with the knight. After knight takes, there is queen takes on d7. But Pragg does include bishop to f4, and after queen goes to b4, we have bishop to c2, and Pragg is looking to rearrange the pieces to start attacking this weak e6 pawn, as well as offer an exchange of queens, which Demchenko accepts. Now bishop to f6, and rook to d1. A nice little tactic here. You cannot take this way. Oops, you cannot take the knight because something like bishop to f4 or bishop c1, I guess. Bishop to f4 makes more sense because now e5 doesn't work. But the point is that the two bishops are skewered, and if you were to play this, then takes here, and rook e5, white is simply so much more active here. The bishop is already hanging, and also you'll go up a pawn. So, rather than this, Demchenko moves his own rook to the d file, trying to build a counterattack on this center pawn and exchange this black e6 pawn. But the problem is that even if this black e6 pawn disappears, there's still the f5 pawn, which will become a huge weakness. So bishop to f4 played again by Pragg, stopping this pawn moving forward, also unleashing the rook on the e6 pawn. Bishop goes to e8, looking to exchange this d pawn for this e pawn, which Pragg goes for. We see a lot of trades, and rook goes to e7. Very human move here, targeting the b pawn, going for bishop to e5, and trying to get this advantageous endgame. If you were to get greedy and gobble here, then there'll be a capture. And I guess, yeah, okay, wait, no, bishop to d6 even. Bishop d6 is a nasty move because rook f7, bishop to b3. A lot of traps in the position here, but Demchenko does play bishop c6, which is the best move, and after bishop to e5 and exchange, you may be like, how on earth did Pragg win this? Well, with a lot of endgame finesse, after pawn to g6, he goes h5. Now, undermining the black structure here after you take, there will be a crippled pawn structure. So captures, captures. Not taking with the rook, by the way, that might make things a little bit too simple, because after rook takes, I guess you can even start pushing down this h-pawn, try and exchange it off. If you can trade rooks and trade off another pawn, the bishop will not beat the other bishop. So we see Pragg keep the rooks on the board, gives a check, and takes a pawn. Now he is temporarily a pawn up, but after the check and rook to d2, Demchenko will win back one of these two guys, and the rook goes to f4, rook goes to f5. Cuts the king. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because Pragg starts pushing his majority on the king side, and then this weird move, king to f6, seems like a strange move to be a mistake. Apparently the only way to go was trying to start pushing these pawns down the board, although this seems a little bit counterintuitive because these pawns, the more they push, the weaker they get. So king to f6 played, and now rook to c8. And the point is that you can't push these pawns anymore because the rook is just going to get behind on this b pawn. And if you play pawn to a4, then the bishop can simply move. And you are running into problems with rook to b6 stuff, and these pawns are just frozen. Although that's kind of what happens in the game after the check and king to h4. We see a4, bishop goes back, and king to e7. The only move to survive, by the way, if you play something like rook to e7, then rook to b6 check forces the king back, and I guess bishop to e6 and f5, f4, very similar to what happened in the game. It could be quite problematic. f5 comes, pushing the pawns down the board, and after this check, the game is effectively over because the king went to the wrong square. The king had to go active. It went a little bit passive, and after bishop goes back to bishop goes to e6. Now king to f8 does make sense, by the way, because you want to stop this pawn from promoting, and you want to block the pawn with the king. But it actually puts the king in a mating net, which is probably the last thing you're expecting in this endgame. After this, h-pawn ends up dropping off the board. It's actually just very easy for the white king to get involved. If Demchenko didn't start getting desperate over here, he would have just lost this pawn and the king would have run in. So he starts pushing his pawns down the board, but it's too little too late. Pragg gets behind the pawn, captures it, and after bishop to e2, rook to a4, x-ray defense of the g-pawn, Pragg wins the game. He's 2 pawns up. There's nothing more to do. Now, this kind of move, rook a4, is something I really like about top-level chess, which is just how fine the details are. If this pawn was on c3, for example, this might be a draw because the rook wouldn't be able to go to a4 or to g2 or any way to defend this g-pawn. So it's just how precise these guys are that I think is really impressive. So now that I've finished with this game, let's talk about some of the other standings. I think I'll probably will end up covering some of the second place finishes. But other than that, I do just want to say that India has put up a really, really impressive show. Well done to everyone congratulations to everyone on the Indian team, which I believe is Gukesh, Arjun, Praggnanandhaa, Vidit, and Pentala Harikrishna. They've all just played some amazing chess in the Olympiad. I think Gukesh basically farmed the Olympiad for like 30 rating. Pragg played absolutely on form. Arjun, of course, was playing like a beast. And Vidit also putting some really good games in, and Pentala some nice draws here and there, and I think he might have also won a game, but of course he is their reserve. So anyway, if you guys did enjoy this video, please do consider liking and subscribing, and as always, I'll see you guys in another video. Bye.